Oh, this is
Good to
super.
see you.
Oh,
Good to see you.
I didn't realize the Jackson 5 was the official music of core development, but okay with that, I guess. Thanks for getting up early and coming out. We're going to be talking about the core development process. My name is James O'Byrne, and we've got what is probably the biggest panel of the open source stage, at least so far. Maybe that bodes well for increased developer participation. We'll see. But yeah, I'm really excited about the panelists that we have here. So maybe we can get going. We've got a lot to cover. Yeah, let's start off with some intros. So Andrew.
So I'm Andrew Chow. I work on the Bitcoin Core wallet. I'm the wallet maintainer, and I'm at Blockstream.
Hey, I'm Jeremy Rubin. I'm a Bitcoin contributor. I work on Sapio, smart contract framework for Bitcoin.
hi, I'm Gloria Zhao, or Glo Zhao. I work mostly on Mempool and P2P at Brink.
I'm Luke Desper. I mainly try to focus on making full nodes easier for people to use all over the place in practice.
Hey, I'm Carl Dong. I work for Chaincode Labs, and I used to work on reproducible builds, but now modularizing the consensus engine.
Very cool. So let's start off by talking about some repository mechanics. So as you all know, right now, Bitcoin Core is hosted on github.com. It's a Git repository, and there are a number of contributors, obviously, who work on Bitcoin Core in this venue. But there's a kind of special class of contributor, or maybe not so special, as we'll find out, called maintainers. And Andrew is actually one of these maintainers, and we hear a lot about them. There's kind of a mystique surrounding them. So Andrew, maybe you can talk a little bit about who the maintainers are, what they do, and their roles.
So the maintainers are the people who have the ability to merge code into the Bitcoin Core code base. And it's actually largely a janitorial role. Maintainers look for other contributors to review code and agree with the changes before they merge them. They're not like unilaterally adding things. It's mostly just like, seeing that things that got reviewed make it in. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Jeremy, what has your interaction been like with maintainers? How do you?
I think that what's difficult with maintainers is there's a lot of good, but I think what's difficult is that what the community sometimes expects from the maintainers is different from like what contributors expect. Mm-hmm. And then you have to tell maintainers sometimes like, hey, the community is wanting you to do this. What do you think? And they're like, oh, I don't want to be doing that. That's not what a maintainer does. And you're like, you should probably like there's some sort of miscommunication with what the expectations are. I think the expectations from maintainers are really clear though. And I think they've been like really good at doing what it is they're supposed to be doing.
Can you give an example of when those expectations differ?
So in particular, like I work on some consensus changes, and people want to know like, oh, like when are the maintainers going to merge it? And I can communicate to maintainers like people would like to know like like this, like you should communicate that formally that it's not something that you're doing. But I think it's hard to sometimes get these like. People don't really want to communicate some of those things sometimes.
And I think there's like a difference between how Bitcoin Core treats maintainers versus other projects. So like in a lot of other projects, you have kind of like the benevolent dictator for life, and they get to decide everything that's going on, what gets merged, and where the roadmap is going, whatever. But Bitcoin Core doesn't have that, and we don't really want to. So it does lead to sometimes maintainers are just doing the work of clicking the button versus deciding the direction of the project, which we really want to leave up to the contributors and community for where Bitcoin is going to go.
Yeah. So I think maybe when a lot of people hear Bitcoin Core, they're thinking about the rules of Bitcoin, how it functions, the consensus mechanism. Gloria, we know that there's a lot that happens in Bitcoin Core that isn't necessarily related to consensus, and a lot of the job of the repository is to manage details that aren't related to that. So how are the two different?
Yeah, I think when people think about protocol, they often think about consensus rules, so like scripting rules, for example. And then the next most obvious thing would be the P2P protocol, like what messages are sent and understood by all Bitcoin nodes. But there's so much, that's only like a small fraction of what Bitcoin D is, which is also a small portion of, or a major, but not the full portion of what Bitcoin Core is. And people often say like, oh, Bitcoin development's so slow, but there's like dozens of PRs merged every day. There's bugs fixed every day, and I just don't think it's true. I find it very hard to keep up with all the pull requests and issues that are open to the Bitcoin Core repo. So yeah, there's a lot more than consensus, and a lot of the biggest impacts that we can have at a protocol development level are not actually in consensus, right? Peter Willa is known for many consensus changes, but I would even say that his biggest contribution is ultraprune, AKA turning the state from let's look at what outputs are available in the blockchain and instead just keep a small UTXO set. And that, I think, did more for scalability than almost any, or more than any consensus change that we've had. Likewise, I guess I'm going to shill my own bags. Package relay is not a consensus change. It does require a lot of community, like, consensus, not consensus, but like, agreement. But it would also be a very impactful change. So hopefully my message is consensus is overrated, and there's a lot we can do without requiring a soft fork.
There's also a lot of things within Bitcoin Core that so since I work mostly in the wallet, these are gonna be some wallet examples. But we do things in the wallet, some new innovation, and then other wallet software will, pick them up, see that they're good ideas and use them. And that's also not a consensus change. And in fact, it doesn't even really require agreements between different software. But there's a large component of Bitcoin Core where we make changes that are basically local, and then other people also pick them up because they seem like good ideas, and vice versa. We've taken some ideas from other people as well.
So Jeremy, I know you've spent a lot of time on OpsCTV, among many other things, but specifically OpsCTV in terms of consensus development. Can you just walk us through the process of how changes to consensus are proposed?
I would if I knew what it was. I think that it's kind of funny because we have this whole BIP process, and that's something that Luke knows a lot about because he's the BIP editor. But there's really no fixed set of things that you have to do, say, or talk about. It's sort of this maybe rough process where you just decide kind of like you're who's the gopher who comes out and looks at his shadow and is like, is winter going to keep on going? You just poke your head out and see if people shout at you and what they shout at you about. And then you're like, okay, it's going to be in another 6 weeks. Or you're like, actually, maybe it's going to be another 6 years or something like that.
So does that make you Bill Murray?
I definitely sometimes identify with the notion of doing the same thing every day and the same thing happens. So I would say maybe, yeah, I'll take it.
That's funny. So, as Gloria was talking about earlier, Bitcoin D is composed of a lot of different components. It does a lot of different things. It's the one piece of software that people participating in Bitcoin have to run. So I think it might be useful to go through and enumerate the different parts of Bitcoin D. So just in quick succession here, let's start with Carl and kind of go down the list and have each of you talk briefly about one component of Bitcoin.
Well, yeah, so I can talk about the consensus engine, I guess, or what people would call validation. So you guys know how Bitcoin has a blockchain, and so the blockchain has to be kept somewhere, and basically it's kept in what we call validation code, or what I like to call sort of the consensus engine. It keeps track of all of the blocks. It keeps track of all the UTXOs, which are basically the coins. And what it also does is it defines what it means to be Bitcoin, basically. It's the arbiter of truth of whether a transaction or a block or something is valid, which makes it a critical part of Bitcoin. And all of the consensus engines across all of the nodes on the network basically have to agree for consensus to be formed, and if they disagree, then that's what we call a sort of an unintentional fork, and that's bad. So yeah, that's what the consensus engine or validation is.
Just picking a part at random, the mining module essentially decides which transactions the miner is going to put into a block they might potentially find. So when a miner finds a block, it has a certain list of transactions, which the miners can put any transactions they want, but the mining module figures out what the best transactions are that meet the miner's value.
Cool. I'll talk about P2P, I guess, which is where I think a lot of the ideological values of Bitcoin kind of come to life in code form, which makes it very interesting. So this idea of like, oh, it should be permissionless, but not just that, it should be censorship resistant. Anyone should be able to join the P2P network and broadcast their transactions. But that also makes P2P's security model like extra hard mode, because we want anyone to be able to join and we don't want to be able to tell who's who, but also there are going to be bad guys. We have to expect that. And that allows for very interesting, very anxiety-driven development sometimes. It makes review kind of spicier. And yeah, we're always thinking about privacy and security and DOS attacks. So that's my pitch for P2P.
I guess I'll go into the mempool, which is the list of transactions that are to be confirmed into a block. It sort of serves as the glue between the last three modules you heard about of consensus, the thing that gets finalized, mining, how we pick the things to finalize from the mempool, and then also P2P, like how we get things into the mempool to give to those other two modules, and then use the mempool to also figure out what to put into the P2P network ourselves. And so the mempool is, at least I view it as sort of like this central plane for all of Bitcoin, where it sort of touches all the different parts, and it stores all the transactions that you might ever do in Bitcoin, and each node has their own mempool. There's no one global mempool, but there's also a philosophical mempool of all the transactions that somebody in the world somewhere knows about.
And of course, I'll talk about my favorite thing, the wallet. Of course, everything else we've just talked about wouldn't matter if you didn't have a wallet to make transactions. So,
Store value.
well, you still need a wallet. So the Bitcoin Core wallet, it does things like manage your UTXOs, manage keys, figure out what addresses, what scripts to be watching for. And I find it to be actually very scary to be working on the wallet, because it's like the one thing that users interact with a lot, and then if you do it wrong, you might actually end up losing people's money. And of course, you never want to lose someone's money, which is, so the wallet is a pretty big component, and there's a lot of work going into making sure that things are secure, that funds are still available, and that we don't do anything weird with it.
And there are many other components that are fairly crucial to running Bitcoin, like the RPC interface, the graphic user interface, that maybe are sort of non-essential, but niceties that help everything run. So let's turn now to the development process itself. Working on Bitcoin is, notoriously, I don't want to say difficult, but it definitely has unique attributes that make it time-consumptive to work on. So, Carl, how have you found doing large projects on Bitcoin Core, and why do you think the review process is so intense?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is logic that I've heard from other people, and I think I agree with. Sort of on the surface is sort of, if we just sort of walk away from Bitcoin, it still kind of works, maybe default compilers would change and all of that, but it so kind of works. And which is why I think that, Bitcoin has such a conservative, model of reviewing PRs and getting them through. Not to say that I fully agree with that or agree with the lean or anything. So I think that's what it is. I think personally, when I'm trying to get across large changes, what has been really important is just like getting the rationale up. Writing a big document about the rationales, the FAQs, sort of socialize the change, breaking up into little reviewable pieces, which has been sort of like a culture that has developed over the years as review has become more and more stringent. One thing that I found to be really helpful is sort of dealing with and talking with people about potential flaws or potential downsides or potential alternative strategies sort of up front. I find that really helps get people across the line after they've had a lot of context. Yeah.
That's great. Gloria, a lot of your projects require coordination, deep thinking, trying to sort of emulate how mempool policy changes and peer-to-peer policy changes will kind of ripple out through the network. How do you feel that developing for that part of the system differs from other tasks in Bitcoin?
Right, yeah, I think a lot of people underestimate the amount of advocacy work that you have to do, even just to change something that doesn't require anyone to coordinate, right? Like, I think it's kind of understated how bad it would be if we merged a change that had an assertion that is not supposed to be hit, but could potentially be hit if a peer sends us something in particular. Because then you have a crash bug where someone can attack the network and just shut down all of the nodes running that version with that bug in it. And sometimes we change something here and something breaks over there, right? Like it's pretty I think we should be careful about changing things. So I guess I'm more on the conservative side of development. But yeah, like with policy and P2P, with policy changes, I guess policy exists in this gray area, and we can both speak to this, where like there are no.
What is policy?
Okay, sure. So policy is the set of validation rules that we apply to unconfirmed transactions. So not transactions in blocks, but ones that we receive on P2P or through the wallet, for example. And they're local to a node. Usually the user is able to configure them, and we do hope that people stick to the defaults because it's more safe. But if you're a miner, for example, and you have more resources, you can afford to make your mempool have a higher maximum dynamic memory limit, right? But yeah, that's why there's this kind of gray area. You cannot really expect people to adhere to a certain policy. And for example, in Lightning, they might take some liberties in using a few bits of the end-sequence field to communicate the ordering of transactions in their channel, for example, right? Or I think we've tried to say oh, maybe we should make this non-standard, but actually Colored Coins is using this to flag certain transactions in a certain way. So this is kind of this no man's land where people can use it for their purposes. And that's why it requires so much coordination when we try to change policy, because if we accidentally make something non-standard and 99% of nodes on the network are Bitcoin Core, and then 99% of those nodes are running default policy, well, you cannot really expect your transactions to propagate if you're relying on something that the Bitcoin Core developers unilaterally decided to make non-standard, right? Which is why we don't unilaterally decide that. But I think it's good to have this usable space for people to develop applications, of course. And that's why it's so important to have a nice communication between, protocol or L1 and L2, because this is an interface that we rely on to make the ecosystem work. Like, obviously, we cannot scale to millions of transactions per block, so we rely on these applications, such as Lightning, to scale. But also, if the first layer is broken, or if transaction propagation doesn't work the way it's supposed to, then maybe Lightning is vulnerable to ping attacks, for example.
So as time has gone on, I've seen for myself that it feels sometimes as though development in Bitcoin Core has become more arduous. And that sort of makes sense that the process would get a little bit more heavyweight as the value of the network grows, say. But I know there are a lot of early developers who feel that it's very difficult to work on the code now, and it continues to grow in difficulty. Jeremy, can you talk a little bit about whether there's good reason for that, and how we might be able to keep the development process safe, but also kind of nimble and approachable?
Yeah, I think that I have a pretty specific take on. Currently, a lot of Bitcoin Core development happens more as an artisan process than an engineering process. And I would delineate the two if you want to think about building a bridge, where in an artisan process, you might be more concerned with like the aesthetic detail of like, what is the color of the bridge? What's the molding on the bridge look like? Are we using, teak wood or something like that? And the engineering concerns would be asking questions of like, how many cars need to be going? What's the load? What's the peak load? How many lanes do we need? And those would be things that would be more concrete engineering constraints. And I think the reason why there's a difference in why Bitcoin ends up being a little bit more artisan and we could benefit by being more engineering driven is in an engineering driven process, you can define some sort of objective acceptance criteria for, is this bridge a satisfying bridge for our need? And if it is, you can proceed. I think Bitcoin as a community, we've been very resistant to having standard processes required because people view a standard bar for something as something that an adversary might be able to say, I've met the bar, and the bar that I met was for introducing a bug, and everybody can see it's a bug, but now there's a standard thing that was satisfied by it, and now we're screwed because we said we would accept anything that met that bar. I don't think we have to commit ourselves so strongly to that, but I do think that by having better standards, that means that you have things like a pre-flight checklist of like, one example of something I think is maybe a new idea would be like, any peer-to-peer or like policy change that we implement, we should back test against every previous block that we would be able to relay all the transactions that come in the next block into the mempool. And there are obviously non-standard blocks that get mined, but what that would give us would be to say, okay, if we're introducing a new thing, anytime we introduce any policy, we should always have a backtest that tells us if there are new transactions that previously would have been okay, right? And that's the sort of thing where if you're in an engineering process, you can define more of these criteria, and the more criteria that you have, it's actually, even though it's more arduous, because you're saying, well, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, it's actually easier because you know exactly what you have to demonstrate, and you can work towards a concrete goal. And I think as long as developers aren't trying to adversarially be like, I'm going to come up with a rule that's not going to trigger this test, and then I think you can actually get more confidence in the review process. And so I think that's something where the solution to make it less arduous is to make it more strenuous, if that makes sense.
I don't think it's very safe to just have like a checklist. I know that's not exactly what you're saying, but like security is not if we meet all these checkboxes, it's secure. There's always like, I think it's more about developing this kind of like adversarial thinking when reviewing code, and that's not something you can really just teach.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you that you can't just purely rely on your checklist. I think that we just have kind of like empirical evidence that like things like checklists and actually like redundant checklists for like mission critical things in like aerospace do reduce critical failures, and they make sure that when you're doing something, you never let yourself rest on an assumption of like, oh, this is a small change, we don't need to audit it in this way. You always are saying, well, it might be a small change, but we still have to go through all of these steps, no matter how big or small we think it is. And so it doesn't let you skip any of the things in between. And in terms of code review, one thing that I've heard recently is that like apparently a large number of developers maybe like mostly review the tests when they're looking at a code change rather than like reviewing line by line every piece of the code. And that was like really surprising to me because I usually almost never look at the tests and I always go line by line through the code. And I think that that's something where at least understanding like, well, if you're acting, you actually should have gone through line by line of the code and at least read every single line before you act is something that like maybe is like a checklist type thing that would be, you know, an improvement.
That
So-
seems pretty obvious, yeah.
But I guess people don't do it, so I don't know.
So like a necessary but not sufficient checklist is.
Yeah, I think that's something where like, yeah, it's more annoying if anytime you want to approve a pull request and you're saying it's an act,
Yeah.
that you have like, you know, like 10 tick boxes that you have to do, and it's like, did you review every line of the code? You know, and if you didn't, it's fine. You know, but you know, it's like it would just mean it would get more information of like, have we actually satisfied, you know, the pre-flight checklist?
Yeah, because there's a big space between what we can do with static analysis. So for example, like, you know, for the CI system, that's basically a checklist, right? It's an automated checklist versus sort of there's a big spectrum between that and what you have to, you know, think about on like a design level when it comes to P2P and stuff, right? So, you know, you could have, you know, things in the middle which are not yet automatable, but is somewhat, you know, just, you know, you can describe it, let's say, fully, and you can have a checklist for, God, I would love to have that for bash scripts and things that shell tech can't catch, and modular dependencies and stuff, which are not, you know, enforceable.
Yeah, for example, you know, when Jeremy was talking about the idea of backtesting transaction broadcast based on historical blocks, I think that's a great check, and you could probably write a functional test. Well, that's difficult because
It's going to take a few hours.
It's going to take a few hours, so
Right.
there's almost this zone between, you know, functional test and something that someone would do manually, where, you know, you might have a simulation framework or something to check some of those things. So I think that could be a really valuable project for somebody looking to get involved with Bitcoin, is to kind
But where do
of
you-
focus on the testing regime between those two.
Sorry.
So talking about the development process and maybe some of the difficulties associated with it, one of the ways that, you know, this could be resolved, and Luke, you know, I think the route that you've taken is that you have your own implementation of Bitcoin, a fork of Bitcoin called Bitcoin Knots. And, you know, obviously you can make the argument against that having an implementation that's unilaterally controlled by a single person is risky, that, you know, having multiple implementations in the first place comes with some non-obvious risks. But how would you make the case that that's actually sort of a good thing to be doing?
It basically gets all the, everything that would be a good idea to merge, and probably safe is merged into Bitcoin Knots, whereas Bitcoin Core releases take the more careful and extra careful review approach. And so the users have the options between, do they want to have something that takes this extra careful approach, or do they just want to have something that has all the latest and greatest and hopefully safe enough?
Right, so it could function, I guess, as a good test bed, maybe.
Right, it can be used in a lot of ways, potentially as testing and others.
Great.
Yeah, I would like to add on to that. The project that I've been working on is called Lit Bitcoin Kernel, and it's a project to extract sort of the consensus engine out of Bitcoin Core. And one of the rationales, or one of the problems that we're sort of trying to solve, is that people have different, and as Gloria has mentioned, like, people have different expectations for how they want, you know, their mempool or their validation or sorry, mempool and sort of the rest of the code, like wallet or GUI or RPC and all of that to act. And as Luke has said, you know, perhaps they want to be more, you know, experimental, or have, you know, features that perhaps can't get into Bitcoin Core, right? So the options right now for experimenters like that are, you know, you either go through, as I hope we've painted a picture of PR review being very stringent, let's say. You either go through with PR review and try to get it into Bitcoin Core, which is hard, but also is a burden on maintainers, right? This is not a piece of code that you write and then that's it. We have to maintain it throughout time. So you either do that, you either fork Bitcoin Core, which is what Luke does, and every release you have to rebase, and perhaps Bitcoin Core structures it in a way that now makes it really hard for this critical feature that you have. And I think Luke has run into that problem before. And then the third way is just to sort of re-implement Bitcoin Core, right? And if you re-implement Bitcoin, then you are sure to get, almost certain to get sort of consensus incompatibilities, which, as I described before, consensus incompatibilities is what leads to, unforeseen or unexpected bugs, which is, sort of what keeps all of us up at night, I would say. And so having this sort of extracting out sort of the part that defines consensus allows experimenters, and I think it speaks to the strength of our community that we have people who want to experiment, have people who want to implement features, have people who want to tweak parameters. It sort of allows people to experiment with that and not have to worry about the consensus compatibility part, not have to sort of try to cram it into Bitcoin Core and make it a burden on everybody else, not have to do the fork thing. So I on a personal note, I'm very, very happy that there are experimenters out there, and I think we should encourage them.
So I think your project, LibBitcoin Kernel, is one of the most exciting initiatives ongoing in Bitcoin Core now, because you could really see the inner workings of consensus packaged up very nicely in a format that allows people to build a lot of the policy components or optional components of Bitcoin kind of in the way that they like to, without risking some kind of major consensus fault. So with that under consideration, Carl, how do you see Bitcoin Core's scope kind of expanding or contracting over, say, the next 5 years? What do you think will ultimately be a part of the Bitcoin Core process? And this is just me speaking personally, is I would hope that sort of there is the project is to basically delineate a clear boundary between what is consensus and what is not, right? And the big problem right now is that when we make a change, because everything is all tangled up into this like spaghetti monster mess, when we make a change, we don't know if it'll affect consensus, and sometimes, to Jeremy's point, we probably need a checklist for this. Sometimes we introduce like a block filter, and then it becomes part of consensus, and you're like, okay, what? So I think delineating that boundary means that it's a technical change, I think, to sort of a social problem, where now we can have more eyes on the consensus critical part, and and the sort of outside realm can be swapped out, and we won't have to have like, we just have too many flags right now. We don't have to have like 100 flags just for all the use cases that people have, and that I think will make the review process easier, because people now know what is consensus critical and what is not, right? And it'll make things a lot smoother in a social sense, I think. So, Andrew, you work a lot on the wallet. You're the wallet maintainer. The wallet is one of those parts of Bitcoin that is not consensus critical, but is still very crucial to using Bitcoin. And it's something where the design space is very open. So you obviously have a number of different wallet implementations. How do you see the repo evolving over, say, the next 5 years? What components do you think will be in there? What won't be, maybe?
So I think eventually what we want to have is to have the wallet be a separate repository, and it uses the interface exposed by LibBitcoin Kernel or whatever the node part stuff remains. And we've actually observed this with the GUI, kind of, where all the work on the GUI is actually occurring in a different repository where it has its own issues, has its own pull requests, and that also makes it easier to keep track of what's going on, and makes it easier for people who care about the GUI to work on it. Same thing I expect to happen to the wallet, and maybe some other components of Bitcoin Core as well. So as we break it up a little bit so that people can focus on the things that they care about without having things get lost in 100 PRs of something completely different. And yeah, so I expect that there will be a wallet repo in the future once we get libbitcoin kernel or multiprocess implemented.
Do you mind if I try something?
Absolutely, yeah.
How many people here run a Bitcoin node? Great. How many people here use the Bitcoin GUI? Okay. How many people here use the Bitcoin wallet? Bitcoin Core wallet? Okay, good number. How many people here run a transaction index? Okay. What's another good optional thing?
Block filter index?
Yeah, who runs a block filter index? Okay, a few people, right? So all these.
Does anyone configure their mempool differently from defaults?
One person.
One, two.
You all have to come talk to Gloria afterwards. We do not know anybody who does this, and it'd be really good to know what you're putting in, and we'll talk about like maybe why you really have introduced a vulnerability for yourself by doing so. So yeah.
I'd like to repurpose the remainder of this panel to just poll the audience about what features they actually.
Yeah, no, well, so to bring it back to what these guys are talking about, and I think about this too, is that we are shipping a lot of code onto your computers that you're not running, and we would like to give you the minimal possible thing that's going to do what you're actually using. Like probably most of you said you were running a node, which is like tremendous, but then all the other things were maybe a little bit more specialized, and what would be really good is if we could have this thing that's just a node that you can run, and then these other things you actually can get maybe a more competition among service providers for that functionality, which if we're all capitalists, who here's a capitalist? Okay, that's good, most of us. So if we're, we think maybe that will get us a better end result, eventually. So I think that that's sort of maybe the motivation for some of this.
Yeah, and I also think then you can ship more versions of the GUI and wallet and not have to rely on Bitcoin Core releases.
Who here likes dark
faster.
mode?
Yeah, maybe dark mode faster.
Luke, you looked like you wanted to jump in there and say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I disagree with Gloria and Jeremy in that I think it would be ideal if every user decided their own policies for themselves. We have defaults, but they really shouldn't be used as some kind of consensus rules. Relying on them to be identical across the network is insecure and really should be considered a security risk in general.
So I think that there's like, the difference of what we're saying would be like, imagine you have your wallet.dat file, and the setting that you choose is to make it readable by anybody on the network. And like that would be if you're selecting the folder for your wallet.dat as like a shared open public file, like that would be an insecure setting, right? And then for consensus, there are things that are similar where if you like picked a really bad parameter, like or even for policy, that our implementations just can't handle those parameters.
To a large extent, we avoid policy settings like that, though.
Well, that's why it's configurable, right? We have like startup options for you to change it. But like, yeah, you're right. Feel free to use your config options. But we try to make the default as safe as possible.
Like right now, though, it's kind of hard to change your own options. You have to, make the bitcoin.com file and know how to format the lines and put all the right options there. At least, if you're using the GUI, there's almost no way to change any of like your relay options from within the GUI itself. So it's.
Bitcoin Nuts does have several GUI options for that. Hopefully it'll eventually get into core. There's a few PRs left.
There's some work there that no one has reviewed.
None of them are using the GUI though.
True.
So with the remaining 3 minutes, I thought that maybe we could turn to ways that you guys think we might be able to grow the developer ecosystem in Bitcoin Core and just increase the health of the project. So I'll just open it up to the group if there's anything in particular you think we could do.
Yeah, I have a few ideas. If there's anyone in the audience that's interested in contributing to Bitcoin Core and maybe doing it full-time in the future, there's this great thing called PR Review Club. It's bitcoincore.reviews. We do a weekly meeting where we pick a Bitcoin Core PR, and there's a host. It's not always me. There's a host that will come up with a list of notes as well as questions. So you kind of get an opinionated tour through this area of the code base and hopefully walk through some questions that start to build up your mental model of what adversarial thinking looks like when you're reviewing a PR in Bitcoin Core. And hopefully as you've done, maybe if you do like 5 to 10 of these review clubs, you've gotten a good breadth of different areas of the code base, and you find one that you want to dig into very deep, and maybe you write a functional test that tests something that very specific that we don't have coverage for yet, or a unit test, or whatever it is. And then you look through the issues and you find there are many features and bugs in that particular area of the code base that we don't have enough people to work on. Anyway, all I wanted to do was shill PR review club, bitcoincore.reviews.
I guess I'll be annoying again and just say, who here, if there were not an obstacle to it, would like to be a Bitcoin Core developer? Okay. Come find us and tell us what the obstacle is that might be stopping you from doing that, and we'll try and find a pathway to making you do that thing.
And for what it's worth, I think there's a lot of funding out there at this point. There's probably more funding out there than you think, and it's just been so fantastic to see companies in Bitcoin step up and provide those resources. So if you're kind of on the margin, if you want to get involved, really do consider it, get into touch with any of us, and we can try and point you in the right directions. But it's a really great time to be a Bitcoin developer, so please consider it.
And I would just say you don't have to be smart, you just have to keep on trying.
Absolutely. Persistence is totally underrated.
We could always use more reviewers.
Always use more.
You don't necessarily need to be able to code, but if you can read code, reading code is very different from writing code. So more reviewers is great.
I think it's worth mentioning. People don't often acknowledge that the main bottleneck in Bitcoin Core is getting suitable review, because nobody wants to merge code that hasn't been scrutinized, hasn't been analyzed by a lot of people working on the project. So get involved, and there are a number of ways you can review. You can just download the code and run it and build it. You don't even necessarily have to try and understand the code if you're doing something to add to the process. So great, we're out of time. Well, we've got. Oh yeah, now we're going up on the timer. We're out of time.
Number go up.
Timer go up. I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists. I want to thank you guys for coming to this. I hope it was enjoyable.